spreads, sides, or sprouting from the ground, once key components to our diets are dying out. These are the ingredients that just don't get the love they once did. In 1933, Procter & Gamble published a book titled Crisco Recipes for the Jewish Housewife, in an effort to, as the title suggests, get Crisco into more Jewish households. It marketed Crisco as a kosher alternative to the chicken fat-based schmaltz, advertising Crisco as healthy, clean, and cheap. This campaign proved hugely successful, and Crisco became a staple in Jewish households and far beyond.
The most important invention since they put mayonnaise in the jar.
Part of the problem with Crisco is that it used to be made with trans fats in the form of partially hydrogenated oil. When many studies came out beginning in the 90s that linked trans fat consumption to higher levels of bad cholesterol, many people stopped consuming the ingredient. While Crisco has since removed all of its trans fats, its reputation was tarnished enough that people still associate the brand with the ingredient. At the time, big companies conducted their own studies to prove that trans fats weren't actually bad. To their dismay, however, those studies backed up the results of previous research, and ultimately, there was no getting around the fact that trans fats are unhealthy. Even in recent studies that look at the new, non-trans fat version of Crisco, things do not look good for the health reputation of the product. One 2019 study published in Nutrients even found that Crisco and other shortenings increased inflammation and the risk of developing fatty liver disease in rats. Jell-O salads, aspics, and other forms of gelatin have a long and interesting history. Gelatin dishes go at least as far back as medieval Europe, where they were a sign of wealth, and elaborate molds eventually became dining centerpieces for the elite. They fell out of fashion, but had a major resurgence in 1940s and 50s America. There are two primary reasons for gelatin's big resurgence. It began as a way to encourage home cooks to ration food during World War II, as dishes like Jell-O salads and aspics allowed families to use up food scraps in creative ways. These dishes were also often a sign of social mobility, allowing cooks to prove that they could still concoct fancy meals despite rationing and nationwide shortages. By 1968, Jell-O sales were at an all-time high, but then steadily decreased until 1987, when it sold about half as many boxes as that peak. As history professor Can Al-Bala told Atlas Obscura, gelatin is one of the very few foods that goes so radically in and out of fashion. We're in one of those periods where it's totally out of fashion. In the early 2000s, Jell-O tried advertising its products as a low-fat dessert. However, with the fall of the diet culture so prevalent during that era, Jell-O suffered once again, showing its inability to work its way back into American households. While Crisco is classified as shortening, margarine lies in a category all its own. There are some similarities between the two, as both products are made with partially hydrogenated vegetable oils and used to be full of trans fats. The main difference is that shortening is always 100% fat, which means that it has a higher melting point. For its part, margarine is heavily diluted and is sometimes as low as 35% fat. Since the mid-2010s, sales of margarine have been declining, probably because of their association with unhealthy trans fats. Margarine brands like I Can't Believe It's Not Butter used to market themselves as a healthier alternative to butter, which is why they were so successful in the early 2000s when diet culture was arguably more prevalent.
But what? I can't believe.
When it became clear that margarine wasn't actually healthier, however, consumers increasingly turned back to butter. It didn't help that, once brands got rid of trans fats in margarine in the early 2010s, many people were deeply unhappy with the new taste of most margarine brands. As a panel of taste testers summarized for Consumer Reports, consumers who were used to a particular taste and expectation may be reacting strongly to any change in their coveted product. Because of this trend, margarine maker Unilever even considered getting rid of its spreads division altogether. While many of the items on this list are made in factories and contain problematic ingredients, gooseberries might have just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is not necessarily their fault that they aren't eaten anymore, but due to several factors, they are largely absent from our diets today. Part of the reason that we don't eat gooseberries anymore may be because they are rather sour. More importantly, they aren't a popular farm crop. In fact, one farmer told The Telegraph that gooseberries are rarely sought after and that they might go extinct altogether. The farmer lamented the fact that people can rarely tell the difference between the various types of gooseberries, as some of them are sweeter than others, which complicates selling them even further. Furthermore, gooseberries have a relatively short shelf life, which further dissuades grocery stores from stocking them and farmers from growing them. It doesn't help that gooseberries almost went extinct at the beginning of the 20th century. In the US, the fruit was infected with a disease that almost wiped it out completely. This disease, known as American gooseberry mildew, spread to the UK and nearly decimated their crop as well. The fruit has been farmed less and less ever since. One of the last UK farms committed to growing gooseberries went so far as to tell The Telegraph they guess there's a 50% chance they'll be growing them by the mid-2030s. Turnips have a long and winding history, having grown wild throughout Europe thousands of years ago. They were a Roman favorite, and according to Foodprint, Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder considered them one of the most important vegetables of the era. But while they were once esteemed for their healthfulness and versatility, turnips have lost much of their popularity in recent generations. According to a survey conducted on behalf of Veggie Tracker, turnips are the most hated vegetable in America, with 27% of respondents saying that they dislike the vegetable. However, it's possible this hatred stems from the fact that turnips are rarely eaten anymore, and therefore more likely to be severely misunderstood.
Now, if there's a Tibetan turnip that will allow me to breathe underwater for an hour, then great.
While turnips were a beloved vegetable thousands of years ago, over time, this slightly spicy member of the mustard family became food for the poor and livestock. Turnips have also been a last resort during many wars and times of food insecurity. During World War I, German civilians were forced to replace their bread and potatoes with turnips due to food shortages. During World War II, British citizens in turn may have had more turnips than they probably would have liked. To many diners, this association with poverty and dire times remains to this day and contributes to the vegetable's unpopularity. In recent times, people have also turned to easier to use and more common root vegetables like potatoes and carrots. With all of these historical aspects combined, it makes sense that the turnip so often lies forgotten. The quince is a unique fruit. It may look like a combination between an apple and a pear, but it has a flavor profile all its own. It's often described as slightly citrusy, but far more mellow than biting into a lime or lemon. It cannot be eaten raw, but once it's been cooked, quince tastes great in jams, compotes, cakes, and more. The fact that it needs to be cooked down probably has something to do with its unpopularity, as people simply don't reach for fruits that are either too sour or require much extra work to enjoy. That said, quince used to be much more popular than it is today. The history of the quince goes back to the Silk Road, which is how the fruit became popular throughout Europe. Once traders began to bring the fruit throughout Europe, it quickly gained popularity. Tales of its medicinal powers began to circulate, and according to quince's growing and cooking, Pliny the Elder even claimed that quinces could ward off the evil eye. Until the Middle Ages, quinces were more widespread than apples. They were deeply valued at the tables of the wealthy, royal, and aristocratic, who served them as delicacies in an attempt to show off their greatness. By the 20th century, however, quinces had lost much of their power and allure. Without servants to do the prep work, wealthy people realized that quinces were much more trouble than they were worth. Acorn flour is an ingredient that used to be incredibly important on the American continent and was also prevalent in Europe for a time. It was used by Native Americans to the point where some tribes cultivated huge forests for agricultural use. For example, a member of the Hashimen Nation told KCRW that acorns were first roasted and then ground into a meal, and often served as a mush that resembled cream of wheat. Acorns were also eaten during the Middle Ages in Europe. While the nuts were primarily used as food for livestock, by the time the medieval period rolled around, they were also deployed as an emergency source of food for people. Medieval Europeans would dry acorns and grind them into flour, then use this flour to make bread, especially during periods of scarcity such as war, famine, or poor harvests. While it makes sense that Europeans stopped eating acorns, considering it was never a staple food and the nuts were difficult to work with, the reason that the ingredient isn't common in America is due to European colonization. American oak forests grown and tended by indigenous people were cut down by colonizers looking to clear land. Over the years, many aspects of native culture were suppressed, including the use of acorns in the everyday diet. Miracle Whip has been cited by numerous blogs and internet users as the worst mayonnaise brand out there. Before it fell out of fashion, however, it had a long journey. Miracle Whip was introduced in 1933 at the World's Fair in Chicago as a scoopable alternative to salad dressing. The condiment was soon considered a competitor to traditional mayonnaise. While it is similar to mayonnaise in terms of color, tangy flavor, and spreadability, Miracle Whip is made with less oil. It is lower in calories and fat than mayonnaise, but it's also made with a wider variety of ingredients, namely sugar, oil, eggs, vinegar, spices, and water.
Bad news for turkeys, good news for you. With more flavor and half the fat of mayonnaise, Miracle Whip makes a better turkey sandwich.
Speaking with Southern Living, dietitian Chelsea Edwards explained that it's really a toss-up to determine whether Miracle Whip or traditional mayonnaise is the healthier of the two. As she explained, mayonnaise is less refined and less processed, which might be more desirable to some people, whereas the lower fat of Miracle Whip may be more important to someone else's nutritional needs. Miracle Whip, like Jell-O, found a foothold in the diet culture that was very prevalent in the 1990s and aughts. However, as people turned more towards natural, less processed products, they also turned away from Miracle Whip. For this reason, it seems that folks are generally more likely to opt for traditional mayonnaise in today's market. Another ingredient that Americans have just lost interest in is iceberg lettuce. According to the USDA Economic Research Service, iceberg lettuce consumption was steadily decreasing, while romaine lettuce consumption was on the rise until 2020. That is the year the two ingredients crossed paths, and now it is very likely that romaine has surpassed iceberg lettuce in popularity. The big change occurred in the late 80s, when Fresh Express, a lettuce grower based in California, figured out how to preserve and maintain the freshness of pre-cut, pre-washed, bagged salads. Before this, iceberg lettuce was the easiest to transport and store. Now the possibilities are nearly endless, with tastier and more nutritious greens easily found in your local grocery store in plastic, pre-washed tubs. Iceberg may have retained its popularity if people actually liked it, but as it turns out, that was never exactly the case. Restaurateur Alice Waters wrote about her distaste for the vegetable in the San Francisco Chronicle, saying, "It is omnipresent. It doesn't have a season. It doesn't have a sense of place." An opinion columnist for Vice also relayed some criticisms for it, writing, "Iceberg, on the other hand, tastes like solidified water, which, yes, is ice. Its fault lies in its name. It's filler lettuce with virtually no nutritional value." With folks publishing such passionate critiques for what was once a pretty major staple in kitchens across the world, it seems that iceberg lettuce's days are numbered at best.